Did you start that fire?
No.
How can you tell when a person is lying? Oftentimes, his or her body will provide a clue: a quick pulse, sweaty palms, and a stammering speech. For the better part of a century, police have interviewed suspected criminals using instruments designed to help separate fact from fiction. These polygraphs, or lie detectors, have become an important investigative tool for law enforcement agencies, including Henrico County Police Division. But polygraphs have limited use and remain controversial because the science behind them is imprecise.
It's not a lie, if you believe it.
Did Kimberly steal Joe's baby?
I don't know.
Did Billy sleep with Allison's best friend?
I don't know.
Now we're going to run a few tests. This is a simple lie detector. I'll ask you a few yes or no questions and you just answer truthfully. Do you understand?
Yes.
Do you ever say bad words?
Yeah.
Sometimes?
A little bit.
A little bit, what you're saying?
Polygraph is probably one of the media, TV shows, movies, things like that, that is kind of highlighted as this, I mean, it's called a polygraph, but what do we call it? A lie detector, right? So there's this assumption that by putting someone on a lie detector, we're gonna catch you in your lie. We're gonna be able to say, you got hooked up to this, there's nothing you can say that we won't catch you in, that if you're lying, we'll know, or that if you're telling the truth, we'll know. And so those misconceptions come from TV shows, and it's like everything in criminal justice. TV shows and movies make it a lot more glamorous than all of us that do it every day really seeing what it is.
No peeking. Did we eat pot roast for dinner tonight?
Yes.
Was it undercooked?
No, it was rare. It was a little rare for my taste.
But I do think that the biggest misconception based on popular media is that it is a true lie detector. I mean, one of the things that I think when you talk to the polygraphers, they'll tell you they're looking at, are people deceptive on a question or not? They're not saying you lied. They're saying that when we asked you that question, it seemed like your response was deceptive. I mean, that's what they talk about. But TV says it's a lie detector.
A precursor to the modern polygraph was developed in 1915 by psychologist, lawyer, and inventor William Moulton Marston. He went on to create the superheroine character Wonder Woman. Her fictional weapon, the lasso of truth, could stop and force a confession from the most hardened criminal. But outside the pages of comic books, sorting truth from fiction has proved far more difficult. Marston's polygraph tracked the subject's blood pressure during questioning. A sudden change was interpreted as a sign of deception. By the 1920s, police in Berkeley, California viewed the polygraph as a valuable tool in investigations. John Larson, a police officer with a PhD, was intrigued by Marston's machine. In 1921, Larson introduced a polygraph that monitored breathing patterns as well as changes in blood pressure. A subsequent model, developed in 1938 by Leonard A. Keeler, added a third indicator, perspiration. While there have been advancements, the polygraphs used today are fundamentally similar to Keeler's machine. The Henrico Police Division has had its own polygraph testing unit since 1980.
So you're here to take a polygraph for your communications officer position with Henrico Police Department?
Here in Henrico, we use polygraph for pre-employment screening tests. So anybody that is trying to get hired on as a police officer or a communications officer has to take a polygraph examination as part of the hiring process. We'll also use them for criminal investigations as well. But it is a great tool for our detectives and officers to use to figure out where they need to go with their investigation. Polygraph examination is voluntary. And yeah, it has to be voluntary because it's called a psychophysiological detection of deception. So part of it is, it's not just recording your physiological changes, but it's about the psychology of it. what are you thinking of? Where's your mind at? So you can't really conduct a polygraph examination with somebody who's hostile or very angry the entire time you're sitting there talking to them. And for that reason, it has to be voluntary. It's something where they come in, and it's something that they can use to tell their side of the story.
The idea is that when somebody is being asked a question that they do not want to answer in the quote-unquote truthful way, that they will have a physical reaction that will be picked up by the machine, which is why you often see the needle of the test and in movies moving very erratically.
A lot of people do think that a polygraph can be entered into court, and they think that the only time it can't be is if it finds someone innocent. You know, that the idea is that, well, you don't want to have that entered into court because that person was found to pass the polygraph or not pass the polygraph. And in actuality, it does not meet the evidentiary standard. That does not mean that someone taking a polygraph, that the results are invalid. It just means that the court system has looked at the fluctuation and the validity and the reliability of outcomes of polygraphs and have said, we as a court system in the United States don't feel comfortable with it meeting our evidentiary threshold. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's flawed as an investigative tool, that it's flawed as an employment tool. It just means that it doesn't meet that consistency standard that the court system has upheld. So I think that that's one of the biggest misconceptions, is that somehow everyone who takes a polygraph, the outcomes are not accurate because the court system doesn't allow it in, when that's not the case.
When we're talking about scientific evidence being admitted during the course of a trial, there is a standard by which we evaluate whether or not that scientific evidence can in fact be admitted. And the idea is that we want to have a sense of reliability, scientific data, research, so that if an expert would be to take the stand on a particular issue, that their role is to be there to assist the jury.
It is a measure of physiological response. And so the assumption, which is not a bad one, is that when people are not telling the truth, their body gives them up. That's sort of the argument. Their heart beats faster, their pupils dilate, they get sweaty, they have faster respiration, those physiological responses. And so that is sort of the argument behind what you're measuring. And so if anyone's ever had a polygraph, the different things that they put on you are measuring those kinds of things. And so sometimes the struggle becomes that people would have those involuntary responses, and they are involuntary. I tell my students sometimes it's trying to not close your eyes when you sneeze. It's really hard to do. Those involuntary responses they can have because they're nervous in the situation. That the fact that this machine is hooked up to them, that there's a law enforcement person asking them questions, make all of those physiological responses happen naturally. Now, really good polygraph examiners try to get some really good baselines so that they feel like they have a good idea of what your threshold is and where they can see those variations. But the court keeps holding on to the fact that that lack of validity and reliability consistently over time, like we would with other kinds of forensic evidence, that's the threshold that's an issue for the court system.
And when that big chair clicks, that's going to be right, and I'm going to get my rights.
Charles Manson, someone who's found guilty, who is incarcerated for being part of many very horrendous violent crimes of that time, has passed multiple polygraphs over time. His defense attorney and he continually says this is a sign of why I'm innocent. He has always said he is not guilty of these crimes. Everything about Charles Manson as a psychologist, which I'm one, we all say he meets pretty much the standard of a criminal sociopath. And one of the things about criminal sociopaths is they have absolutely no remorse for the most horrific things that they engage in. And so if you think about the fact that the polygraph is measuring your physiological arousal when questions are asked, Charles Manson doesn't have any physiological arousal to the questions asked about the horrific crimes that occurred at that time because he doesn't have any remorse for them. He doesn't see those actions as being anything that are shocking or would cause that response. You could ask him, you know, about apples, oranges, and bananas, because in his mind, as a criminal sociopath, there's about as much emotionality as tied to those inanimate objects as the death and torture of these individuals.
The way that it was explained to me was that he could be a sociopath and believe what he's telling you, but polygraph is based on the fear of consequences. And even if you're a sociopath, the consequences are, if you get caught, you're going to jail and you no longer get to do that thing that you want to do, if that's killing somebody or something like that. There are certain people that just answer it and have no fear of those consequences, so they would be able to pass it, but it's very rare. And then you get back into who was the examiner that ran that test. Generally with those high-profile tests, they have like the best examiners in the world running them, so you can't really fall back on that. When you take a polygraph, you'll come in, you'll sit down with me. We do what's called a pre-test phase of the polygraph, and we just basically sit there and talk for a while. If it's a pre-employment test, the applicants have already filled out what's called a personal history statement, which has a lot of information about their employment background, any criminal history, driving record, those types of things. And we'll basically sit there for a little while and go through that information, and I ask them a bunch of questions about it. And basically I'll just tell them, you just need to be honest with me when you answer the questions, so that they have no problems when they actually sit down to take the actual polygraph test.
Most people have some secrets of some sort that they bring into the room with them. And most of those secrets are not relevant necessarily to what we're looking for. And sometimes people come in and most people have secrets. They have things that they're concerned about or things that they're thinking might potentially be on that exam. And so the job of the skilled polygraph examiner is to make sure that those concerns that they have are alleviated, that we address those concerns, and again, most often they're not even relevant to the polygraph exam. So it's better to come in and be upfront and honest and talk about things that are concerning you during the exam or before the exam during the interview.
A lot of times people will tell a detective one thing which is close to the truth but not exactly the truth. Then I just tell them, just tell me what's really going on so we can figure out what's the appropriate question to ask you when we actually sit down to take the test.
So as the examiner is giving the polygraph exam, if they present a question to the person and the person responds to that question, we'll see a significant spike in the tracings. And that's because that person is having that fight or flight sort of physiological reaction to the question. They're concerned about their answer that they've given. They're thinking about things that they have not yet disclosed, or they're trying to prevent from disclosing to the polygraph examiner. So you will see significant spikes throughout the exam at the questions that are causing that person difficulty.
There's several different components that are going to be hooked up to your person. We will hook up what's called a pneumograph tube. The pneumograph tubes, there's 2 of them. Basically, the pneumograph tubes, they just record any changes in your chest cavity, any respiration changes, that sort of thing. Also, we'll hook up what's called galvanic skin response plates to your fingertips. And then we also hook up a blood pressure cuff, just like when you go to the doctor's office, a blood pressure cuff.
If a person's trying to control those body functions, it's almost immediate. The polygraph examiner will see it on the instrumentation, they'll see it on their screen, this attempt to sort of, change their physiology, which is practically impossible.
In our polygraph suites, we have very nice chairs that have a motion sensor in the seat, and then there's a motion sensor in the feet. So that will show you if somebody is trying to possibly do some kind of countermeasure where they're moving their feet or they're moving their body in some way. They're very sensitive, so those motion sensors will pick up on that. We'll ask them the questions that we've already reviewed. They just answer yes or no. And then we'll do that, usually we do that about 3 times, no more than 5 times. Generally going to be 3 outcomes. Either you're going to pass the test, so no deception indicated, you're going to fail the test, which is deception indicated, or it'll come back inconclusive and sometimes no opinion. The inconclusives don't happen very often, but occasionally you'll fall into this inconclusive range where you had some reaction to the question, but it wasn't such a significant reaction that's going to put you into the deceptive range.
So when conducting a polygraph exam, while the instrumentation is phenomenal and is accurate and it does its job, you have to have a trained polygraph examiner. You have to have someone who is well versed in reading the charts, who can understand the physiology as they see it come across the screen. You can't have one without the other. While the instrumentation is phenomenal, it really requires a trained polygraph examiner to interpret those charts as they're coming across.
When you're confronting, particularly a suspect, when you're confronting them with the idea that law enforcement believes they have actually committed the crime and they are staying steadfast on their position that they in fact did not commit the crime, and if they are given the opportunity to explain their side of the story and then they are administered the test and the test indicates that they're being deceptive, that also gives law enforcement another tool to go back to the individual and to say, you said that you were being truthful, you didn't commit the crime. However, we must let you know that this test is suggesting that there's something that's on your mind that is preventing you from wanting to share the truth. Sometimes law enforcement, we get lucky and we'll get maybe a different fact that we didn't have before. So the value and the utility of the polygraph examination has not diminished, and we will continue to use it in our efforts to solve crime in Henrico County.